Hi, and welcome to Introduction to Economics, and we're going to be looking at Chapter 10. Chapter 10 is actually two chapters, which most authors put into two separate chapters. So there's a lot of learning objectives in here. The first thing we're going to do is to take a look at the labor market. And what you want to remember is demand and supply that we've already studied. And remember that in demand, we're always going to hold all else constant. We're then going to turn our discussion a bit to inequality. And the inequality will look at income distribution, the inequality that happens in wages and differentials, which we'll talk about what that is. And then we're going to talk a little bit about poverty, income disparity, the top 1%, that kind of thing. So let's go ahead and jump into our first objective. Now, I want to provide some context. I'm not going to test you over the context. You don't need to know the types of markets and so on, but I wanted to give you some context because we skipped some chapters just because we only have 15 weeks. And so I wanted to give you the context of those chapters because we do skip some things. So I also have some examples, which I think will make things a little bit easier to understand. Up front, know that the marginal revenue product, I might use the term marginal product of labor. They're the same thing, okay? But again, I think the example will help to situate that for you. So without further ado, let's go ahead and let me share my screen with you. Okay, so our first objective is to define the marginal revenue product. Now, I don't think I'm going to have you calculate these things on the test, but you will want to know kind of how to do it. I'm trying to make the questions on the upcoming test a bit easier, particularly in the multiple choice area. And so we're just going to define what the marginal revenue product is. Okay, so let's start with the demand for labor. Now, remember that back when we studied supply and demand, we said that the x-axis down here was quantity. We're going to change that up a little bit, and we're going to say it's the quantity of labor. Okay. Over on the y-axis, we put price. Now we're going to put wages. In studying the demand for labor, you want to put yourself in the context of your hiring people. So demand for labor, and we're going to talk about why it's downward sloping and so on. Remember, all else held constant. The idea here is basically that as wages are higher, you're going to want to hire less people. As they're lower, you're going to want to hire more people. Okay, so let's go ahead and take a look at the marginal or the demand. Marginal revenue product is the way your book phrases it, or the marginal product of labor. Now, when we hear the word marginal in economics, we want to think incremental. We also want to recall that we will do an action as long as the benefit of that action is greater than the cost of that action. So in looking at labor, here's an example. So let's imagine we don't hire any workers, so we have no output, and we can sell our product for $70. If we don't have any output, we're obviously not making any money here. If we hire one worker, there's the marginality. Notice we go from 1 to 2 to 2 to 3 and so on. So that's why you'll see this bracket in between. If we hire one worker, then they can produce 5 units, our quantity, if you will, or our output. Okay, our quantity of labor would be 1, our output would be 5. So we get the marginal product of 5 because the one worker is giving us 5 output. But the questions become, how much does that worker cost us? And we'll get into that in a moment. They're giving us 5 units of output. We can sell that output for $70. And that's where this $350 comes in. So depending on, again, how much labor costs us, would we hire that one worker? If they cost us, say $10, okay, then we definitely would, because the cost of $10 is less than the benefit of that worker. Here, we're going to hire a second worker. That second worker will give us 4 additional units of output. So now we have 9 total. The 4 times the 70, the 4 additional units of output that the second labor hour gave us, will give us the 280, and so on and so forth. Now, you might be asking yourself, well, then is there a right amount of workers to hire? And the answer is yes. And I'm going to show you that in an example coming up in a moment. So the marginal revenue product, what is it? Here's our definition. The increase in the firm's total revenue, and total revenue is whatever our price is that we can get in the market for our product, times the quantity or output. And you saw that in the 350 in the previous slide, resulting from hiring an additional unit. So again, the marginality, additional unit of labor, or some other factor of production. This is all based upon a thing called the production function, which we haven't studied because we do skip some chapters. So how do we calculate the marginal revenue product? It's just the price times the marginal product. So again, I'm going to show you an example. I think it'll make it a lot easier. Because we didn't talk about different types of markets, and your book does talk about them a little bit, so I wanted to cover them just briefly. There are 4 basic markets. It's a continuum. And in the first type of market, a perfectly competitive market, maybe the best example is a farmer's market. Here, all the products are the same. Everyone in this market is a price taker. Because if you go to a farmer's market and apples are $5 at one stand and they're $4 at another, you're going to buy based upon the price. But because apples are homogeneous, meaning all the products are the same, then you're going to go with the lowest price. So here, buyers have most of the power. Okay. I'm going to go all the way over here to the other side of the continuum for monopoly. In a monopoly, there's one and only one producer. They are illegal in the United States, but we still do have monopolies which are government sanctioned. When we have one and only one producer, then basically the monopoly becomes a price maker. And here, sellers have all the power. In between the two, we have we have monopolistic competition. In monopolistic competition, the products are differentiated, meaning that consumers believe there's a difference in the products. So here we might put Nike and Reebok. To some buyers, there's a big difference between these two products, but for others, there's not. So we tend to see in monopolistic competition that sellers are taking back some of the power because they're differentiating their products from others. And we tend to see also that they will spend a lot of money in advertising. Most consumer goods and services will fall into this monopolistic competition category. If we only have a few relatively large producers, and those producers are able to block entry of new products into the market, which will lessen the number of substitutes, we see that the sellers are starting to even have more power than they did in monopolistic competition. Many times, monopolistic competition and oligopolies can be thought of very similarly. And if you're looking at a consumer standpoint, and looking at bottom up, you might say this market is monopolistic competition, but then you find out there's only a few producers. And so now you're looking at the supplier down, and you might say it's an oligopoly. So again, these two are hybrids, if you will, in between the perfectly competitive market and monopoly. So how do we measure marginal revenue product in a perfectly competitive market? So a farmer's market. Okay. In a perfectly competitive market, there are some things that you probably would not have studied, but I present them in my micro class. And basically, one of the things we know that price is equal to marginal revenue. You don't know what that is yet, but that's okay, which is equal to average revenue. No big deal, okay? But basically, remember, everyone's a price taker. So price is a driver in the market. So what we say is that the marginal product of labor, okay, times the price is going to equal our marginal revenue product. Those are all terms that we're studying in this particular chapter. Let's see an example, which I think will make it a little bit easier to understand. So all of this is based upon a production function. And so here we're going to use an example. We have Farmer Jack, and he's growing wheat. He's got 5 acres of land, and he can hire as many workers as he wants. So you might be looking at this and say, hey, I recognize this. This is a factor of production. It's land. Land here is going to be held constant at 5 acres. Here, factor of production labor, he can hire as many as he wants, and the labor is going to be what we call a variable cost. Here, land would be a fixed cost because it remains constant regardless of the number we produce. But the workers, because they're variable, they could go up and down depending on how much wheat we want to produce. That becomes a variable cost. And we're focused in this chapter just on this labor idea. So here's an example, and we have the number of workers we can hire, and then their output or the quantity that we get from them. No workers, no output. So there you see the green dot at the origin of the X and Y axis. We can hire 1 worker and they'll give us 1,000. The second worker gives us 1,800. So you might be thinking, well, what's the marginal product of labor here? When we hired this 1 worker, what was our increase? 800. Make sense? And then as we hire a 3rd worker, we get 2,400, 4, 2,800, and so on. Now notice that when we went from 2 to 3, marginal change of the workers was 1, and they only gave us 600 additional benefit. 3 to 4, again, 1 worker, they only gave us 400 additional benefit, and so on, and 200. Now we're going to talk about this idea here. Okay, so if we connect these, notice how this is making a pattern. And the thing is that, yes, there will be a right amount of workers to hire. And this is where the cost and benefit become equal. So we would probably want to hire 5 workers or less in this particular example, again, holding all else constant. If Jack hires more workers, his output rises by the marginal product of labor, or marginal revenue product is what your book is terming it as, which is the same thing. Okay, so again, any input is the increase in output. So notice that we saw the change in output as we went from 0 to 1,000, the change in output, actually, wrong. We went from 0, the output was 0, and then we added 1 worker and it was 1,000. So our marginal revenue product was the change in the input, 1, change in output, 1,000. So here our marginal product of labor would be 1,000. As we went from 1 to 2, change of 1, and that was 1,800, change there being 800. And again, notice ceteris paribus. So the change in output divided by the change in labor. And this is how you can calculate the marginal revenue product of labor, or the marginal product of labor, same thing, okay? Don't get hung up on the definitions, but the change in quantity, what's the output that we gain? And what is the change in labor? How many workers did we go from? So if we went from 0 to 1, it would just be 1 minus 0. If we went from 1 to 2, it would be 2 minus 1, and so on. Okay, so now we can really look at that marginal product of labor very simply. We get the change in quantity divided by the change in labor. Okay, you don't need to know this, but I do kind of want you to understand that the marginal product of labor diminishes, meaning we don't get as much return for each worker. So some people ask, well, why is that so? And it's because of when we add an additional worker, what happens is there's more coordination of effort that needs to happen. If we have Farmer Jack here and Farmer Jack only has one tractor, then we have to coordinate the labor. If you've ever been to a place that had too many people working, a lot of people were standing around, those are individuals that got over here, businesses that are over there. And actually the benefit of those workers is not as much as the cost of employing those workers at that particular time. Okay, cool. Hopefully this is making sense to you. Okay, so when he hires an additional worker, his costs rise and his output also rises. But what we want to do is hire as many workers as there's a benefit. So here, if the output is rising by greater than the marginal product of labor, so if our cost of that worker is less than the marginal product of labor, we're going to go ahead and hire that worker. If they're equal, we are not. Okay, so again, the average worker has less land to work with because that factor is fixed and they become less productive. And we call this the diminishing marginal product. It's based upon the law of diminishing returns. And it basically says, as you add more and more inputs of a factor of production, the output of that becomes less and less. So how do wage rates change the amount of labor for Farmer Jack? Obviously, if wages go up, if you're a business owner and you have 5 workers, and then all of a sudden the workers, their cost doubles, what would you want to do? And the answer, of course, is to get rid of some of the workers. So as we look at this, we could also have a decrease in wages. So maybe the labor market, there's lots of people looking for jobs. Very few jobs are out there. Could you pay less? Yes, because supply is greater than demand. And so some people might be willing and able to take that job at a lower price. So a decrease in the wage rate will make us want to increase the number of people that we have. So here is the marginal revenue product illustrated, also illustrated as the demand for labor. And again, you can see the quantity of labor over on the x-axis. Let me do this. Quantity of labor here, wage rate here. Notice there's an inverse relationship that as the wage rate increases, the quantity of labor that's demanded decreases, all else held constant or other things equal. So here, if we're at A, and as the wage rate goes down, we're willing and able to hire more workers. So here's our initial wage rate at 280. Now wages, we can pay less because there's more supply of workers, and we will increase the number of workers that we hire. The converse is also true. Again, if the wage rate goes down, the quantity of labor will go up. If the wage rate goes up, the quantity of labor will go down, all else held constant. So how many workers will Jack hire? He'll hire workers as long as and up until the cost of that worker is equal to the marginal revenue product. He's not going to hire at equal. He's going to hire one less than that. So that tells you the right amount of workers. If you've ever been to a retail store, many times that will be on their point of sale system. How many people, based upon the sales trend that's happening that day, should be working the floor? It takes all of this math out of the equation. And again, things happen. If you're at a restaurant and the big game lets out, that's not something that's in the POS system. It's not something that's in the algorithm that they're using to determine the number of workers. Okay, why will a firm hire workers only to the point where they equal the wage rate? Well, again, cost benefit, right? So as long as the benefit of that worker outweighs the cost of having that worker, we're going to ensure that they are there. Okay, hopefully this makes sense and puts it in a little better context than just the overall bits and pieces that you get in Learning Objective 1. I will see you back in Learning Objective 2. And in Learning Objective 2, let me see what we're going to cover because I don't know these off the top of my head sometimes. We are going to cover the idea of that the labor market is the demand for labor is based upon the demand for the product. And we call this derived demand. So I'll see you back in Objective 2. Thanks.